May the words of my mouth and thoughts of my heart be acceptable before you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Shalom all and welcome to our Kosher Torah school classes. I am of course your host Ariel Tzadok, and you find me, our school online at www.KosherTorah.com. You have to forgive me. I'm holding back a number of chuckles here because just before we began this recording, I was chatting with my live audience here about our canines. I was sharing how, we have, a family of German Shepherds here. And I was sharing just how amazing and beautiful they are and the wonderful things we learned from them. And literally, just as we began our recording here, they all started to bark. And I don't know if it got onto the recording or not, but I just found it amusing that here I am talking about them and they're as if responding. But what can I say? Tonight's topic, we are in a series called the Other Kabbalahs. This is actually going to be the third lecture in that series. And in this class, we're going to talk about a very profound and deep topic, magic and sorcery in the Jewish tradition. Now, magic and sorcery. Let's start from our modern rationalist 21st century position, where, of course, we acknowledge, we know, because we are so wise and smart, or so we think, that all magic, all sorcery, is a bunch of primitive mumbo-jumbo, irrational superstition, of which, of course, in our rational logic, there is absolutely no foundation to anything legitimate, true, or valid, and therefore is not worthy of our consideration. Or at least that is how most people hold today. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, I guess, that description is not entirely accurate. You see, if one does not really understand the nature of what exactly is magic or sorcery, or under a greater umbrella term, the occult, one does not understand it, then one is not able to actually draw conclusions about it. Because I will tell you, as a number of secular investigative scholars have discovered, there are actually aspects of the occultic and magical traditions which seem to be valid. Now, that's a problem if we wish to ascribe to the occult any kind of mystical or magical or even spiritual component. I mean, after all, if the angels and demons are being involved, well, then we should understand. But again, from our realistic point of view, we're not here to talk about the spooks. We're not here to talk about the ghosts and the goblins and the angels and the demons. But we are here to talk about the human mind, psychology. Now remember something about psychology. Remember something about the human mind. And that is that the human mind and the organic physical brain are not identical and the same. Points that have been made very clear in 20th century psychological discovery in the schools of analytical depth psychology from Carl Jung is that the human unconscious is most certainly not limited to the confines of an individual's life and memories. But somehow, as we've discussed in numerous other classes, using my own term, there seems to be some kind of a back door out of the unconscious, or into deeper levels of the unconscious, wherein which all human minds somehow merge into a greater whole. This is what Carl Jung called a collective unconscious, wherein which through the power of mind there is an ability of influence. And in modern times, there is an investigation of these natural, non-magical powers of the mind under the modern term parapsychology. Some people are very quick to dismiss parapsychology as having any scientific validity. However, there is significant scientific evidence that not only suggests but seems to validate the reality of a parapsychological level to the human mind, conscious and unconscious. Now, being that this is true of our collective selves, and even though it might have been put into a scientific format in the 20th century, the reality of this, our human nature, needless to say, has existed within us from creation. And because this parameter within ourselves exists, the interactions with it, though today we understand psychologically, before the dawn of the understanding of the science of psychology, these interactions were understood to be magic. The involvement of other entities, spirits, demons, angels. And this is what gave rise to the existence of and the proliferation of what we can call the occult. And you will see, to the best of my knowledge, every ancient culture around the world has had its own occultic or magical tradition. And I'm not going to banter around with theology or doctrine and refer to white magic, black magic, or any. These things are irrelevant terms for us, because we are here to analyze the experience only after we historically document it. And therefore, I'm not willing or even willing to accept an external involvement, because that's not the application that we seek to understand. Let's go back, way back. We know very well that the book of Leviticus, the Torah, specifically prohibits types of activities, witchcraft. Matter of fact, it states in Exodus, you shouldn't even allow a witch to live. But what exactly is a witch and what exactly a witch does is never really defined. And the later, talking about medieval definitions of witches and witchcraft, to what the biblical definitions were, are radically different from one another. Communicating with the dead, all types of signs and omens and fortune telling and the like, these types of things were biblically prohibited. Now, you can ask, well, why? And the answer pretty much we can describe in modern 21st century talk. We are familiar today with the concept of quantum physics, wherein which we recognize that prior to observance, there are levels of reality which exist in a state of potentiality and not actuality. And only by observance do we, as it says, collapse a wave function from a potential to an actual. If and when someone were to fortune tell about the future which has infinite potentials, collapses in the mind of the believer into the one form or structure which the individual believes, be it for good or for bad. This completely goes against the concept of what the Torah wants to teach us, that as free minds, free human beings, we have choice. And therefore, when we lock out choice or limit choice, we are therefore contradicting the entire foundation of the Torah tradition. That's why the Torah tradition does not seek, involve with, or even tolerate fortune telling, whether it was astrological or other. But with that being said, you will again notice that the prohibitions in the book of Leviticus were specifically designed towards that type of spiritual, if you can call it such, activity. But anyone who knows anything about the occult knows that the nature of occultic activity, magic, sorcery, goes far beyond those limitations. Since the days of the Torah, magic, sorcery, and the occult were very, very much a part and parcel of Semitic culture. Forbidden as they were from the Torah, the people of the land still were very much exposed to and often involved with these practices. And I'm not speaking about just idolatrous involvement with other gods. That's a very exoteric involvement, cultural, social. I'm talking about the esoteric involvements. We have a good example of this in the book of Samuel. We're all very familiar with the famous story of the Witch of Endor, in which King Saul, in a state of desperation to have some semblance of prediction of the future, goes to a witch who conjures up for him the soul of the dead prophet Samuel. We don't have to get into the details of who and what and how and where, but the facts are these. Number one, there was such a witch. Number two, she had such powers. Number three, the king of Israel believed in such powers. That is what's so shocking. That here is a man in such a position of power who actually believed that these kinds of activities were valid. There's your biblical example. We have numerous other types of what we would call occultic or magical activities that existed during the days of the first temple. There were those who knew, or so they claim, had the magical power to tap into the souls of others and steal their souls, causing them to die. Some would today call that a psychic assassination. Believe it or not, I have in my own library books written by great authoritative rabbinic sages, specifically one, written in about, I think, the 1300s, give or take. And he clearly outlines in one chapter how to make what we would today call a voodoo doll. And he explains how the voodoo doll works through the power of what we can, again using modern term, call a transference through the collective unconscious from the mind of one to the other. Apparently, these ideas or beliefs were prominent in the days of the first temple. Going off into Babylon exposed the Israelite culture to involvements with angels and demons and other types of things. But we also must recognize that associated with this, there was always folk healing remedy tradition. Part of the magic and the occult was today what we call herbology. And a lot of the old witches were actually herbal doctors. The old folk traditions permeated the days of the first temple and Babylon. And if you remember, in the days of the kings of Israel, they had to take away the Nehushtan, the brazen serpent, the brass serpent that Moses created, because people were involved with it in some type of, I guess what we would call magical healings. So these things were very firmly believed in those days. From the time of Babel, we have one of the books of what's called the Apocrypha, Sefer Tobit, in which you have the involvement of angels and demons and herbal remedies and healings. This is now becoming commonplace in the Jewish tradition. During the days of the Second Temple, there arose a very deep tradition about the wisdom of King Solomon. It is said that King Solomon had power and dominion over the earth spirits, or inner earth, depending on your persuasion, who were called the Shedim, and how the king of these forces would actually serve Solomon in helping build his holy temple. You have an entire ancient book dating from maybe about the 1st century before the destruction of the temple, I'm almost certain, called the Testament of Solomon, which outlines Solomon's involvement with these entities. We find reference to it clearly in the Agatha, in the Gemara. The Gemara clearly states and embellishes an entire story of how Solomon ensnared Ashmodai by the hand of Benyahu ben Yehoiada and brought the Shamir to help build the temple and the like. These stories about King Solomon proliferated in the days of the Second Temple and beyond. There are ancient legends passed down to this day, books written that claim to be the keys of King Solomon, the magic traditions. These books, one of the most famous ones called the Keys of Solomon, readily available in English. It's a curious and interesting read. No, but the original still exists and is available to this very day. And in it, you will find all kinds of ancient traditions that have been around in Judaism literally since the days of the Babylonian exile. There are numerous books, mostly coming out of Israel, about the archaeological finds of all the ancient magical bowls, incantations, and influence that have been found existing for thousands of years. Even Josephus documents that certain groups of Essenes were known for their names of the angels and their herbal healings. All of these things at one time were considered holy, and later became known under the umbrella of the occult. With regards to Solomon's teachings and wisdom, this became the foundation of a tradition of magic. And as the Western civilization absorbed these traditions, they got blended with numerous elements from old Egypt, Greece, and Persia, and the like. And most of these magical texts today in what's called angelic language seem to involve many of the different symbols. I will share with you just as a side note here. Many years ago, when Rav Kadori was alive, I sat down with him one-on-one, and we went through the Keys of Solomon, Maftech Shlomo, the original handwritten manuscript. And yes, I do have a copy. And he showed me the different symbols which were, if you will, kosher, and those which weren't, based upon his understandings and traditions. And it led me, of course, on my own search and exploration for understanding. But now let's stay focused on the issues here. Throughout the centuries, in Islamic tradition, as Islam grew and developed, the Arab world, of course, absorbed much of the greater culture from all of those different civilizations and societies that it absorbed into the greater Islamic empire. And within it was a tremendous, what we will call, occult tradition. Islam had an understanding of the earth spirits, which they called the Jinn, and it was very different from the Christian understanding of demons. Remember, from a Christian point of view, demons are specific fallen angels, servants of Satan, who are specifically and intent out to be evil, go against God, and to destroy us. But the demons, as understood in Islam, are called, again, jinn, like genies. That's where the word comes from. And a description there is completely different. The jinn, some are good, some are bad. The jinn are said to have a religion. Interestingly, in the Islamic tradition, they speak of there being Christian jinn, Muslim jinn, even Jewish jinn. For those of you who think this is silly, be careful, because the Zoharic tradition, which came much later, also speaks of Shedim Yehudaim, or Jewish Shedim, very much like the Jewish jinn, which puts a foundation on this topic of the occult. Because whether it be the Solomonic traditions or others, involvement with the jinn was not considered evil, bad, and wrong. The types of things sought were not futuristic predictions, the likes of which are prohibited clearly in the book of Leviticus, but rather were a search for power, secrets of the universe, secrets of nature. Some might refer to these things today as natural science. One of the older occultic traditions was alchemy, alchemica, which actually was one of the antecedents of modern-day chemistry. And an alchemist was literally messing around with chemicals. Kind of like a modern-day person. You know, you put the chemicals together and they explode. Yeah, well, that's what it was like in the old days. The great Kabbalist Hayim Vital in the 16th century was very much involved with alchemy before he became involved with Kabbalah. And he certainly wasn't the first Jewish alchemist, and he certainly wasn't the last. But now let's go back. Herbal traditions in Judaism proliferate to this very day. You can go and find books on different types of herbology from the Babylonian tradition, the Yemenite tradition, the Moroccan tradition. There are numerous books about the involvement of different types of herbs, natural healings. All of this was considered in the day as part and parcel of revelations of the occult. And even the likes of a great scientist like Maimonides, a doctor, had to admit that some of these herbal remedies were far more than superstition, but actually had some validity to them. We find numerous ideas and beliefs of this nature expressed in the Talmud, which seems to be expressing or talking about them, at least condoning them. There was a very superstitious element in Babel, which believed in what we today call segulot, that different rituals or practices had some type of benefit in performance. Now, again, from a psychological point of view, we might refer to these rituals as having some type of a placebic effect. But nonetheless, again, people in those days did not understand those types of things. All they know, if they did something, they expected it to work, and many times it did. Faith is a interesting thing. But again, let's go through history. So, this magical tradition actually still exists in Judaism to this very day. You can go on to any one of the online Hebrew bookstores, and you will find dozens, literally dozens. I was at one online bookstore today, and I counted 55 different books, which would be included in this, in quote, magical tradition. But the real juicy stuff, if you will, very few of these types of books have survived. Now, there's an ancient manuscript dating back from who knows when, called Shoshan Yesod Olam, the foundation, the Shoshan, the flower foundation of the world. It's never been printed, ever. But it's out there. I managed to get some pages of it, a long, long time ago, obviously, copies. And it was interesting to see the types of things that people were interested in. So, even though we jokingly state about magic carpets turning you into a newt, or a frog, or a dog, or a fox, imagine if the master could turn you into a fox. Well, don't have the girls come by, because every girl will want to be a fox, and that could be a problem. But let's get realistic again. Yes, there are actual formulas and actual books which teach you how to create magic altars, magic wands with holy names of God on them, magic swords, which are supposedly to banish away things. If anyone has ever seen the cover of my book, Walking in the Fire, or has seen the amulet art that I produced for protection, you will see I have reproduced an image of the, in quote, magical sword, just to document that these things do exist. I'm not saying that they work, I'm just telling you that they exist. So all of these ideas, all of these beliefs, all of these texts have been passed down in Jewish circles and have had a history in the presence of the Jewish people, literally, since biblical times. And aside from the herbological element, the elements of angelic involvement or contacting the Jinn are prolific. Contacting the Jinn. Talking to the spirits. Who does that? Who believes in that? Well, apparently, our great Rabbi Hayim Vital, the redactor of the Lurianic Kabbalah, he did this all the time. For those of you who've ever taken my course from the Book of Visions of Hayim Vital, Hayim Vital used what was called an ancient tradition, in which you would take a scryer, often a young child, sometimes somebody who was psychically attuned, and they would look into a reflected surface, gaze upon it, until in their own eye they would see a spirit, a jinn, an angel, who would come to them and communicate with them. In Hayim Vital's case, this was performed in a mirror. And in his Book of Visions, he goes into elaborate dialogue and discussion with one of the princes of the jinn. This class is so profound that I extracted it from our Sefer Hizyonot, the Book of Visions course, and I posted it on our KosherTorah School YouTube channel so that people can have access to this type of information, to know that it exists. I'm not ascribing to it any validity. I am just saying to you that it does exist. This type of scrying was not exclusive to Jews. Indeed, actually a contemporary of Hayim Vital, who was the chief astrologer and counselor to none less than Queen Elizabeth I of England, a Mr. John Dee, Dr. John Dee, who worked with his own scryer, a man named Kelly, who supposedly was channeling from the angels the secret of angelic writings and the secrets of the Book of Enoch and the like. This entire episode became the foundation of a lot of Western occultism, in which this entire process, which was believed to have been performed in the name of God. Remember, from the point of view of these individuals, they did not hold that the spirits they spoke with were demons, again from a Christian point of view, whose point was, again, that they're bad and evil and wrong and disgusting, but rather that they were benign or good, benevolent spirits. Hayim Vital certainly believed that. Certainly John Dee believed that. And these two individuals in the 16th century was certainly not the only ones involved with this. This has been going on and on for centuries before them, and I mind you, even to this very day. So Hayim Vital, in our Jewish tradition, he documents these things. He has very heavily involvement in them. And the nature of these involvements are still, like I said, practiced by very few and far between people today. There are books that, as I've shared with you, dozens, which will show you all different kinds of things, such as contacting the spirits. One of which, and this is interesting, if you read in the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch itself, in Yoreh De'ah, and section 175, the laws of dealing with the occult, which we have an entire course on in our KosherTorah, school here. Rabbi Yosef Karo himself, the author, encourages people not to go around talking with the Jinn or the Shedim, but does give an allowance to do so under certain permissible circumstances. Now, from a Christian, especially a Protestant point of view, this must be horrible because of their interpretation of what these spirits are. But again, I emphasize that their interpretation and the Jewish and Islamic interpretation are radically different from one another. And Dr. John Dee's involvement in the 16th century, again, top, court, in the court of Queen Elizabeth, he most certainly was not isolated in this. You had numerous members throughout Christendom who were also very interested in these occultic practices. Because most of these occultic practices, if you look at them, are all addressed to God and the angels. It's almost very Essenic. No, they're not looking to conjure up demons to do bad things. And even though the books might tell you how to turn your neighbor into a dog, most are a little bit more benign. Most are involved with, again, silly things like, literally, magic carpets. But the vast majority of this type of involvement was all about healing. Healing. That's right, medicine. So prevalent and prominent was this that in the 1700s, we have a very famous rabbi from Eastern Europe, a place which was haunted heavily by the spirit of superstition, who started a movement which was based on understanding the psychology of our Kabbalistic tradition. And yet, he is not brought down to us by the name of the great psychologist. He is known to us as the master of the good name. I speak, of course, of Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the famous Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. You see, the Baal Shem Tov was renowned for his healing abilities. He would use what we would today call folk medicine or segulot, which by any other definition today would be called the occult. So all of these older traditions were considered by many to be, again, nonsensical or, on the other hand, forbidden. Now, here is an interesting little issue. Throughout the writings of Hayim Vital, he emphatically states that that which he calls Kabbalah Ma'asit, some refer to that as magical Kabbalah, but I am going to differentiate between what we've been talking about and this in a minute. This Kabbalah Ma'asit, Hayim Vital emphasizes emphatically, is absolutely forbidden and it's dangerous and no one should practice it. And of course, there was this awesome legend of the infamous Yosef Delle-Reina and his attempt to topple the forces of evil and how they eventually got him. Is any of this history or legend? That those are clouded in mystery. But that type of fear tactic permeated. And therefore, any involvement of this nature seemed to have been turned off or frightened away the masses. I don't think that's a bad thing. But anyway, but Hayim Vital's definition of what is Kabbalah Ma'asit is clearly misunderstood, because he wrote in his Shemone Sha'arim that Kabbalah Ma'asit, again, we refer to that as magical Kabbalah from the word Ma'aseh, but he refers to the word Ma'aseh, Ma'asit, action, magical, as referring to the Kabbalistic world called Asiyah. And Asiyah as in numerous different spirits who are not always above board, open, honest, and good guys. And he says dabbling with them can be dangerous because they can lie to you just like human beings. And therefore to mess with them is very dangerous. And therefore any involvement with Asiatic beings should be prohibited. But Hayim Vital, as we clearly see from his own Book of Visions, and another book of his which recently came out on Kabbalistic magic, again, available at a hefty sum online. These were the reality of the practices of the people. This is what they believed. In places like Morocco and Yemen, far-flung communities in which the philosophical Kabbalah of the Lurianic system did not limit the older traditions, we still have writings of books and authors who bring down how to make the magical circle, the kind of thing that we see practiced in the days of the Talmud, a magical circle. The ritual ring that one magician or sorcerer would draw around himself to create a holy space. Yes, we find this even in the Talmud. Most people do not associate it with one of the famous stories of faith. Honi, the rainmaker, drew a circle around himself. If you remember the old legend, it says, I will stand there until it rains. What the heck does he need to be drawing circles around himself for? Because we don't recognize the nature that he was practicing the old, what today is called occultic traditions. So you see, all of these things which today we dismiss have a very long and continuing history in the Jewish tradition. And again, I emphasize how significantly different these things were looked at in Judaism, and I add Islam, than they were in Christendom. Now, up until the time of the Enlightenment, where rationalism dominated, and all such metaphysical, supernatural things were completely dismissed. Up until this time, even in Christendom, the interest in the occult was very prolific. Because again, it was not, as many people think today, the worship of the devil, the invocation of demons. Had nothing to do. Go and read the original grimoires, as they are called, and they're all invocations to God. Because they believed that they could approach God, call upon the angels, and ask for the power and the forces of the heavens to align through the powers of the angels. This was the old understanding of the alignment of the planets with the angels, with the forces of nature. This is the old understanding of science. Hayim Vital brings this down. Everybody brings it. This was the old way of understanding the scientific world. And therefore, to find the secret names of the angels and to see how you can, shall we say, get them on your side to help you in many ways. For example, you will find in the books, to this very day, exist formulas to discover the identity of a thief, to have a vision where you could see the face of the thief, how to restore lost items. Let's not forget our good old-fashioned love potions. To this very day, prolifically, how to make husbands and wives love one another, how to find that which is lost. We're all very familiar with. I've even translated some and published in many of my old books, and presently in Walking in the Fire, what's called the Sigulot for Wisdom, where in which you would invoke certain angels and you would call upon them that they should manipulate your mind to make you wise. There are ways called She'elat Halom, a dream question, in which you would call out and invoke certain powers and angels to come to speak to you in your dreams. For anyone familiar with traditional Torah practices today, especially from the Sephardic or Hasidic points of view, these things are readily available even in many prayer books. Prayers for financial prosperity often invoke the angels. For those who've ever read the prayers, again, I've translated them right out of the Moroccan prayer book for the invocation Sigulot le Parnassa, as we call them. You'll find invocations to angels, very commonly said. The names of all of these angels date back centuries. What we have lost is many of the context of ritual. Very, very few today actually create magical altars, wear the magical robes, use a magical sword or a magical wand, something like out of Harry Potter. And in the old Islamic traditions, and again, from there, they were exported into the Christian world. The old teachings of King Solomon were said to proliferate. There was also an ancient book readily available, I think today in English, called The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. Supposedly the translation of a book called Abraham the Jew. Magical book. You will find that the English occultic societies, people like the Golden Dawn, they were very much involved in this. But again, orders of that nature, even though they were Christian per se, did not consider this type of magic to contradict the foundations of their faith. They considered a complement to their faith, almost in the same way as did the Essenes. Now that is, again, how you have to understand this. In the 1700s, again, one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Moshe Zachuto, wrote a book which was considered secret for centuries. And it was only published for the first time in the last few decades. There were numerous editions. The first edition came out, which was rather revelatory. So it was edited and certain things left out when the second edition came out. And then I think today there's even a third or a fourth edition with even more things left out. And I'm speaking of a book called Sorcery Shamot, or The Source of Holy Names. And in this book, it's like an encyclopedia of holy names. I've translated from it. I've taught from it numerous times. It is one of the few resources for what we can call the laws of writing amulets. And an amulet. Interesting things about amulets. We're not supposed to rely on or believe in these things. But some people will swear by them. Some of them are called baduk umenosei, or in other words, that they have been investigated and found to be viable. Again, many people might not like that, but these are authoritative or rabbinic community leaders, sages, who are speaking such, judges of religious courts. And throughout the centuries, prolific throughout many of the Middle Eastern Sephardic communities and the Eastern European Hasidic communities, these beliefs survived. Needless to say, even in old Europe, and I'm talking about in the communities of Rashi, the Tosafot, and these are the days before Rambam, mind you, they were also very prolifically understanding of the occult. Many, what we call the rabbis of the Tosafot. The Tosafot, of course, is that famous commentary to the Talmud, opposite every page of, almost every page of the Gemara in the Talmud, next to Rashi himself. One of their famous masters of the Tosafot was a man named Rabbi Yaakov, a town called Mirush. And he defied conventional practice and did something rather radical. As we know, with regards to Jewish law is meant to be decided by the court of human beings based upon the social needs of the community. As the verse in the Bible says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. We most certainly do not ask heaven for any understanding of Jewish law. Not even Elijah the prophet has the right to come and reveal things, other than the days when it's, the end of days when he comes to help us understand, but never to reveal, but to help us understand. We don't ask angels, we don't invoke heaven, we don't do dream questions or the like. But Rabbi Yaakov, good old Rabbi Yaakov Mirush, defied this tradition. And he regularly would ask an angelic guide for what was supposed to be the law and things. And he wrote a book called Shut Meshamayim, halachic responses that he would ask his angel in heaven, and the angel in heaven would give him answers. Now, needless to say, like I just said, this contradicts the entire practice of Jewish law. And yet, no one condemned him, and some of his traditions are still observed, revealed by the angels, to this very day in Ashkenazi practice. I'll give you the example. As we are familiar, there is a rabbinic dictum that any ritual observance that is specific to a certain time, women are exempt from observing. And a question that Rabbi Yaakov asked his angel was, well, the lulav and etrog, well, we wave them on the Sukkot holiday. What about women? Should they wave the lulav and etrog? And if so, should they say the blessing? Well, in the Sephardic tradition, all right, we do not deny a woman from being able to wave the lulav and etrog if she so wishes. But being that technically speaking, she is not obligated to do so, the responsibility to say a blessing before the deed is not applicable. Well, Rabbi Yaakov said, well, let's ask the angel. The angel said women are allowed to say the blessing. And to this very day in the Ashkenazi tradition, women to this day will say a blessing before putting, waving the lulav and etrog on Sukkot, in contradiction to, the halacha. Somebody's asked me a question in text here. Have I seen the book Shoot Min Shemayim? Not only have I seen it, I have a copy of it on my shelf in my library. If you want to come down to Tennessee, I'd be more than happy to show it to you. Another question that I have here in regards to the mezuzah. We all know that our rabbinic interpretation of the words, and you shall write them upon your doorposts of your house and your gates, refers to what we call the mezuzah. The scroll, we write the two portions of the Shema Yisrael, the Hayim Shemoah, on a scroll, put them up on the door. Why are they there? Well, they're there because God commanded it so. Well, in the European tradition, dating back from the days of Rashi and the Tosfot, they interpreted the mezuzah to have magical properties of protection. And on the front and the back of the mezuzah, they used to write angelic script, the names of angels, and all kinds of magical properties. Well, from a rationalist point of view, we consider that to be ridiculous. Of course, if God commands us to do something, God's commandment is good enough for us. And we shouldn't be transforming God's commandment, which is based upon faith, into some magical superstition. However, the traditions die hard. And although many of the angelic scripts were removed, there's to this very day on the back side of the mezuzah, two names of God which are left on. One a magical name, one a traditional name. The name Shaddai, God's name from the Bible, is written on the back side. And then a strange magical name, Kuzu, B'muchsaz, Kuzu, which for those well-versed know that's the letters of the name Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem, Lord our God, the Lord, written one letter over. Instead of the letter Yud, it's replaced with the letter Kaf, which comes after it. And so it is with all the rest of the 14. Well, this is only one of the continuations of this magical tradition. And it was radically different. The original magical tradition, needless to say, obviously, as we've been saying, was pre-Zoharic. It did not include an understanding of or involvement with what's called the Sephirot or anything of the kind. However, that was absorbed into the later traditions. And to this very day, these things, like I say, exist. In my day, many years ago, when I was in the yeshiva learning the rational, realistic understandings of Judaism, these types of ideas and beliefs were, shall we say, honored in the breach. In other words, they were acknowledged but never really respected. The deeper traditions about, again, magical circles, magical swords, and the like, they still exist. The books are still available. But very, very few. I've only met one or two real masters who knew and understood this material. And these were not the great big rabbis who people know about. But again, there's been a renaissance, if you will, even in this, a growth and rise in superstition to believe in these things, to the point where it's become an epidemic of anti-intellectualism, which itself is very dangerous. Because you see, those who've embraced these traditions, whether it was the mystics in the days of the Second Temple, which led to their insane fanaticism in their demise, to the likes of all types of magicians and sorcerers who go off into weird and wild speculations which lead them into terrible life choices. We saw how this affected, and again, the proliferation of the legend of Yosef Delle-Reina. For those who are familiar with the story of John Dee, again, who I mentioned earlier, his fall. You can even go into modern times and look at the likes of people from the traditions of the Golden Dawn and the like. A lot of times people involved in this life and lifestyle, if they embrace it in the concept of superstition, will fall and stumble therein. Maybe it's very wise, practical, good advice that our Torah prohibits these types of things, and the laws in the Code of Jewish Law, again, are very clear in these matters. Again, I have an entire course on this in our KosherTorah school at www.KosherTorahOnlineStore.com. Go look it up and see all the details there. We don't have time to do that right now. And again, getting back to the point that I made at the beginning of this course, before this class, while we have the few minutes here to conclude. Oh, I believe in magic. Oh, I'm a big believer in magic. But the magic that I believe in is not supernatural. The magic that I believe in is not by invoking demons or Jinn or angels or even God. The magic I believe is in the human heart, the human mind, the human soul. Oh, I believe very firmly in the powers of what today is called parapsychology, the untapped powers of the human mind. That I have seen in action. So you see, the point that I'm trying to make is this. For those who believe, some of these things actually do work. But it's not because that you're using a formula or a ritual or a name. The real magic is in the heart of the believer, the mind and soul of the person. That's the magic I believe in. Because after studying and practicing these things for maybe 40 years, I have seen and discovered this truth. And I recognize and I know it for real. So I'm not worried about any kind of silly superstitions about spooks and spirits and goblins and demons. Those are great, scary stories to spook out children. Good Halloween stuff. But there's no reality to them. We are more educated than to believe that. But the powers within us, for good or for evil, the real power in the use of names isn't in the name. You want a name? Magic names, angelic names to do this? And I'll tell you all the names. I'll tell you the names, the vowels, the pronunciation. I'll tell it to you all. And you'll try them and use them until you're blue in the face and you won't make anything happen. Whereas the simple individual, doesn't matter who or what they are, let them come and pray in the simplicity of faith. And that is where the magic will happen. That is the true essence of the magical tradition. This has been long known and understood in Judaism. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic tradition, this was the crux of his teachings of Hasidism, that the whole essence of the power is within the person, within faith. And all of these externals were a superfluous superficiality, which we have transcended. The history of all of this, as I said, exists to this day. People still believe to this day. They still practice to this day. To understand the truth of it, I think, is a very helpful progression in our understanding of esotericism. Because as we will proceed in this course to discuss metaphysical philosophies, the prophetic school taught us the meditative connection. This magical school is very much integrated and connected with it, because it also was a path towards connection. And the connection is through the self. That is always the wisdom. Through that back door, through the mind, through the unconscious, into what we'll call the greater collective. Everything else is just legend and story. Let's just conclude on that night, and God be on that note. We ran out of time. God be willing, in our next class, we'll pick up and discuss the other topics as we proceed to discuss the other Kabbalahs. Thank you again for joining me. God bless. Good night. And thank you again all for your support. Shalom. 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 Shalom.